Welcome to Inspire Campfire, a podcast where ordinary people tell their stories of extraordinary adventure. These are campfire stories meant to inspire the rest of us to light the fire within, get outside, follow our dreams, and return to tell our own stories. Ready? Let's strike the match.
Welcome to the show. I am your host, Scott Wurzbacher. Today, we are going to talk about going with the flow of life. And in the case of our guest, that means the flow of Class V Whitewater. Our guest is Adam Herzog, and he was first introduced to me by a friend as a world-class whitewater kayaker. Since meeting Adam and watching some of the videos he sent me of the rivers that he's paddled, I can attest my friend's description is undeniable. Adam was born and raised in Western North Carolina, and he currently calls Asheville home, where he lives with his wife and his two kids. Professionally, Adam is a trauma nurse and a paramedic instructor, and he describes himself as a lifelong whitewater paddler. He's taken on some of the most aggressive whitewater possible and has participated in and won many well-known amateur races. In our first discussion together, he expressed to me that his existence revolves around this sport. I am so excited to talk with Adam today about the flow of his life's journey in the water. Adam, welcome to the campfire.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Man, I am so excited. You know, before we got started talking here, I woke up this morning just all fired up because, I just think about like the metaphor of a river. And, it's just such a great metaphor for life because, a river goes through all different kinds of conditions, like a particle of water. You can be in this really still water and then it starts flowing. And then all of a sudden it starts going a little bit faster and obstacles get in the way and the water starts moving faster. And now all of a sudden you're in these fast rapids. And then, you get through the fastest of the rushing water and then it becomes calm again. And it's just, man, it's such an amazing metaphor.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. So I would love to just, let's start with just how you got started in the water.
I grew up paddling in Western North Carolina with my father back in the early 90s. He was kind of getting into it and I was, preteen, kind of junior high school aged kid. We lived in the mountains of North Carolina with not a whole lot to do.
Yeah.
And it happened to be a fantastic place to learn whitewater sports. There's a pretty robust culture of paddling in the area and a temperate climate with lots of rain. So it's very conducive to kayaking.
Yeah. So I remember like the first time we talked, you were kind of talking to me about how like before whitewater, you were sort of in the like skateboard culture, which I just kind of thought that was cool because you made sort of this connection between like the skateboard culture and the kayak culture. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a different medium, but they're very similar in a lot of ways. Individual kind of sport that inspires a lot of creativity, I think, and taking a like in the case of a skateboard, an inanimate object like a piece of pavement or concrete and making something cool out of that. You get in the water and you kind of adapt yourself to that environment. So there's a lot of similarities to that. It's just a very creative and individual sport.
Totally. What resonated with me, I'm a child of the 80s. And so, I grew up watching like skateboard movies and, Tony Hawk and some of those guys were like, sort of idols of mine and my friends. So it's like definitely resonates, but I love that translation into whitewater. So, but you kind of had a unique experience, the way that you learned whitewater, like with your dad, he was, you were telling me like he was very like conservative in the way that he taught you whitewater.
He was, yeah. So I grew up paddling with, as I was getting to, into my early teenage years, I was getting more and more competent. But I was paddling with guys that were in their 40s and 50s. They're real conservative in terms of risk taking. Yeah. And so they were perfectly content to paddle down easy whitewater that was well within their abilities and never really push themselves. I, being younger and more aggressive, wanted to to see what I was capable of. But my dad just straight up just had hard, fast rules that he stuck to. And at the time, I was very resentful. Like, for example, there was a rapid on the Chattooga River in Northeast Georgia.
Yeah.
And it's a famous section of river. It's kind of an intermediate section of river, but it climaxes in this big rapid called Bull Sluice. We name rapids just like, Ski Run would be named. So Bull Sluice is this kind of classic bigger rapid at the very end of the Chattooga Section 3. And, we would get down there, and it was within my abilities. It would have been a little bit difficult for me. Like, it would have been a little bit of a push. And I always wanted to attempt it. And Dad was just, nope, can't do it. Not going to happen. And so it would end up in like a family meltdown or, arguments over the dinner table about whether or not I could run this rapid. But then when I was probably 15 or 16, a little bit older, we were progressing and we were moving down to a further section of river downstream, Section 4 of the Chattooga, which is harder. And you actually put in at the takeout for the easier section. And so, I remember that day very well. He's like, all right, this is the day you can do it. And did it, had a really nice line or route through the rapid. And, that taught me patience. The river isn't going anywhere. And so it's really a value in waiting until you're ready, as opposed to pushing beyond your skill set.
Yeah.
And in whitewater, if you push beyond your skill set, you're taking a lot of risk.
What I love about this is, like, because your dad was conservative with you, it kind of helped you to sort of slow down the learning and really develop mastery of the fundamentals of paddling. So how long of a time period between like when you started and when you really started getting into the more aggressive stuff?
It was, I was probably 11 or 12 when I got into paddling, and then he really didn't let me push it at all until I was out of the house. I was 18, and at that time I was, I did, I guess, what they call now a gap year.
Yeah.
At the time, it was just a year without a plan. But I was raft guiding and doing some sort of like working in restaurants in the winter and stuff. And then I was out on my own, and I was able to make my own risk assessment and make my own decisions. But I maintained that philosophy of waiting until the time was right.
Yeah, I mean, man, it's like, so you had essentially like 7 or 8 years of like fundamental paddling in more risk averse sections, I guess, so that you could really master that before you got into the hard stuff. And I just think, like, I don't know, I just find that to be so cool, because it just seems like when you were finally ready to take that on yourself, you had this foundation that was like completely setting you up for that success, which is awesome.
Yeah, I maintain that to this day. So I go out, like this afternoon, I'm going to go out to a really easy section of river and just do a workout there. And so like we have a mantra in paddling, make the hard stuff easy and the easy stuff hard. So you pick lines or routes or little challenging series of moves and really easy whitewater with virtually no consequence. And then you can adapt that to hard whitewater. And so it gives you a confidence when you are paddling something that's very difficult with a lot of risk and a lot of consequence. It gives you the confidence you need. Like I've done this 1,000 times in a really easy section of river, so I know I can do it here, even though there's a lot more going on.
It's the repetition, and I love
it. Yeah.
I think I heard you say, make the hard stuff easy and the easy stuff hard.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, man, that was so awesome. Okay, so if we have listeners that are maybe unfamiliar with the class system, could we just do a quick little overview of that class system so people kind of have a good understanding of the kind of water that you're paddling in?
It's similar to the climbing grading. So it goes 1 through 6. It is a closed system, so it tops out at 6. Class 1 is flat moving water. Class 2 would be, small riffles and shoals with, no real consequence to being in the water outside of your kayak. When you get into Class 3, you have bigger ledges, waves, swifter currents. And in the case of having to exit the kayak, so, we we roll our boats if we flip over. That's just a fundamental, self-rescue skill that we use all the time, every day. But in the case of a failed roll, or maybe get stuck on a rock or something like that, you sometimes have to exit the kayak or swim. Never the plan, but if you swim in Class 3 whitewater, it's going to be unpleasant. But as long as you have the appropriate safety equipment, life jacket, helmet, those things, it's probably going to be fine in terms of any real injury.
Yep.
When you get into Class 4 whitewater, there's a line. In other words, there's a place to be and a place not to be. It requires some execution of a line, and an errant line will result in potential injury. It can result in death in Class 4 whitewater. And then Class 5, you have waterfalls, tall ledges, powerful currents, long sections of rapids that are linked together. And swimming out of the boat in Class 5 whitewater is, you have a risk of death and injury.
Yeah. And there is a Class 6.
There is. That's a little bit controversial. Some people say Class 6 means non-navigable. Mm-hmm. So when a rapid that is considered Class 6, as progression happens, people push the envelope. And so something that may be considered unrunnable or unnavigable is run or kayaked. When that happens, then that's typically downgraded into 5 or 5+. So it's not a perfect system. And there's definitely some subjectivity to it, but that's the basic concept.
Yeah. So let's talk about Adam and the kind of water that you like to paddle, because you've had this progression. Dad had you when you were paddling with Dad, where were you in that class system?
We were primarily on class, obviously Class 2 to begin, and, progressed to Class 3, some easy Class 4. Mm-hmm. But we never really, and, my dad still paddles to this day, and he's never really cared to go beyond easy Class 4.
Yep.
For me personally, if I have my choice any given day, I'm going to paddle something that's Class 5. But I'm also perfectly content paddling on easier water and practicing.
Yeah. So part of this podcast is I love talking with people about their adventures, but I think for me, it's more about hearing that voice inside that calls us to adventure. So what I want to know for you is can you tell me about that voice that calls you to Class 5?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few reasons why I paddle. One of them is because I paddle. So it's just a habit.
Yeah.
It's like it's maybe not the most romantic answer.
It makes sense.
When I wake up, and I've been doing this for so long, pretty much my whole life, that when I wake up in the morning, one of the first things I think of is, all right, am I going to get on the water today? And what do I need to do to make that happen? If that means I need to get up at 4 a.m. and go paddle flat water in the dark, or go out after dinner, or, are the kids in school that day, and whatever. But it's just become a part of my everyday existence. And I think habits can be really positive and really negative influences in our life. But for me, that's been a very positive one. But beyond that, the thing that I really seek out when I'm paddling is, and we were talking about it a little bit earlier before the show, but it's this flow state.
Yes.
This concept of just not thinking about anything, for even if it's only for a few moments. And that's to me the pinnacle. If I'm paddling a rapid and I'm not thinking at all, then that's what I'm really trying to achieve when I go out on hard rivers. Yeah. And there's a couple other things that I get out of it. One is camaraderie. I have a really tight-knit group of friends, and when you're doing partaking in extreme activities like whitewater kayaking, you bond at a more accelerated rate, I think, than you do in normal everyday life. So someone who I've maybe only paddled with a handful of times, I might feel very close with, because we've had that shared experience. So I get a lot out of the bonds, the friends. I get to go to some pretty amazing places that are only accessible by kayak. Mm-hmm. Spent a fair amount of time all over, the US and into Canada, and some of the gorges that I go to are so, the woods are just so thick and trailless, and the gorge is so steep that there's really no other way to get to those places. And so that's a really unique experience to be able to see a place that's only been, experienced by other paddlers. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, that going to those unexplored places, and then of course there's something about nature that's just it also kind of nature also helps to create those flow states, I think. Real quick, I want to go talk about the flow state that you just talked about. Before we jump into that, though, this concept of extreme sports, right? So yeah, the Class 5, I guess would be considered extreme sports. But I'm curious because you started at such a young age, you've built this foundation. Like, to Adam, does kayaking a Class 5 rapid feel like an extreme sport to you?
It depends on a Class 5 rapid. Okay.
Okay.
So if I'm on my local river, my
Yeah.
local stretch of river is the Green River in North Carolina.
Yeah.
People come from all over the world to paddle
Yeah.
it. There's a big race on it every fall. And it's, if you were hiking in there and checking it out, it would look like just a series of cascades. So it would look very extreme, but I'm out there, 50, 100 days a year, and have probably done it thousands of times. And so that doesn't feel very extreme, even though if you saw it from the shore, you would think it was really extreme.
Yep.
But you develop a tolerance. Okay. So like the first time I paddle a really big rapid, it's going to have a fast rate of speed. It's going to feel maybe a little bit out of control. And then the more you do it, the more you have that like repeat experience, the more things slow down and it feels less and less extreme. Doesn't mean it's any less dangerous. And that can be a double-edged sword because you get more comfortable and it breeds complacency. And the river really hasn't changed. It's just my perception of it.
Yep.
And so it's the hazards are the same. And so you have to be really careful about complacency. So something that I'm doing several days a week will feel really chill and easy, but it's still the same objective set of hazards.
I mean, for you with your experience, I think like risk management has become like part of your intuition, right?
Yeah, and I have a way of breaking that down. So I have 4 questions that I ask myself, and I don't necessarily do this consciously, but it's something that I've developed over time, and teaching my kids how to deal with risk management. This is how I verbalized it to them. So 4 questions. Number 1 is what's the line or the route through a rapid?
Okay.
Okay. So I just look at it, and that's generally pretty obvious. That's called reading the water. And
Yep.
so, it's just like a rock climber would look at a wall, you kind of see the route. So what's the line? Number 1. Number 2 is can I hit it? And that requires some self-assessment, a little introspection, and some honesty with yourself. What can you do it or not? Number 3 is what happens if I don't. So that's the consequence. Okay. What happens if you're offline or you miss your line? Is it going to be you go into a rock? Or are you going to get stuck somewhere? Is there a potentially deadly spot? So what happens if I don't? And then the 4th one, and maybe the hardest one to answer sometimes, is am I okay with that? So what's the line? Can I hit it? What happens if I don't? And am I okay with that? That's how I summarize my decision making. But that sometimes may be me really asking myself those questions, or it might just be a feeling.
Yes.
And I make that decision in 60 seconds. If I take longer than 60 seconds, like, so we get out. So if we're paddling an unfamiliar section of river,
Yep.
we stop, eddy out, stop and eddy, get out on the shore and scout. So we look at the rapid ahead of time, or maybe a series of rapids ahead of time. So we're sitting on the shore making that risk assessment. And I ask myself those 4 questions. If I can't answer those questions in 60 seconds or less, I'm walking around. So I go back, get my boat, put it on my shoulder, and just portage around the rapid. And if I can answer that question positively in 60 seconds, then I get right back in my boat and immediately go for it. I don't hem and haw and screw around. Yeah.
Man, there's such an intentionality to what you just went through. And I'm like, I just took a whole bunch of notes. I'm mind blown. 'Cause I think a lot of people think like extreme sports is just like this incredible, like blind courage. And
No,
what
yeah,
you just described is very, very intentional.
yeah.
It's amazing.
And I would say I'm probably, if there's a range of different ways of people analyze these things, I'm probably on the more intuitive side than some
Huh?
people. Like I have friends who have scouted waterfalls for literally years and like waited till the perfect water level and like gone in there when there's no water at all and swum around in the bottom and like looking for rocks and things. So some people are really, really analytical and have like they know every stroke they're going to take and they can kind of visualize that in their head. And I would say I'm somewhere in the middle. Some people just go on pure gut and charge ahead, but I think yeah, there's a pretty wide spectrum of the way that people analyze these things. It's very it's a very personal decision.
Yeah, and it totally makes sense. I just love the intentionality of it. Like, you've been doing this since you were 11, so the intuition, like you talked about it being habit. I mean, a lot of it is just habit. It's something that you've
Yeah.
developed over a long time, and so it's like deep inside your unconscious and something that just happens naturally for you. So I love this, and I have so I was sharing with you, but before we started here, that I've done a little bit of like study on flow states. And so what's cool is like I've got sort of like this academic knowledge and you have the experiential knowledge. And it's just so cool. Like, but this idea of flow state, it's really this guy, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, wrote this book called Flow. And he defines it as an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. And Csikszentmihalyi actually passed away, I think earlier this year or at the end of last year. But Stephen Kotler has taken up a lot of his work, and he created this organization called the Flow Research Collective. And Stephen has written a bunch of books. One of them was called The Rise of Superman, and it's about extreme sports and how athletes are able to accomplish these incredible feats by entering into this flow state. And so what Steven's kind of created his whole career, like breaking down flow states. And it's just so it's super inspiring to kind of understand like the science behind it, but to be able to sit here and have a conversation and like, kind of dig into the sort of real life aspect of it is just so cool. So like, I wonder if you could just kind of share with us like what that flow state sort of feels like for you when you're in the water.
It's been interesting. I actually tried to read that book and I couldn't finish it.
You don't need to. You're an experience. Some of us have to read and learn and like do it academically, and other people just get after it.
It was a cool book. The Flow is the one I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
It was just too academic for me. I just couldn't finish it. But the experience. So when everything is, I think you said, when you're performing optimally,
Yeah.
what it feels like is you're just operating on instinct, and there's really no conscious thought in your brain. You're just acting, reacting, and interacting with the river in a very primal way. So it's almost like what I would imagine like the caveman and the tiger or whatever. It's very much just well, with whitewater, it's interesting because we talked about this earlier a little bit, but you're literally in flow. So I think, of course, I'm biased, but I
Yep.
think whitewater, maybe surfing, is probably like, at least to me, the ultimate way to obtain a flow state because you're literally flowing down the river.
Yep.
The water's flowing around you, and you mentioned this word too, but particle. But when everything is perfect and you're right where you want to be, you kind of feel like just a particle, a little piece of a little water droplet that's being pushed along. So you're really just kind of you're just being. Everything else melts away, and there's no conscious thought.
Yeah.
If you're having conscious thoughts in those moments, then you're probably in over your head. You're probably scared and doing the wrong thing. You don't want to be thinking. You just want to be acting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool.
And I got to think that like when you're in that flow state, even though the water's moving really fast and there's obstacles around you, like you're not fighting the water.
No, you can't fight the water. Yeah, people talk about like conquering rivers, and that terminology has always really bothered me. Same with mountains or any other natural experience. There's just, you have to relinquish control to some degree. I mean, you want to be in control, but the river's, much more powerful than you are. So you really, fighting it is not going to help you at all. You're only going to waste energy. So you have to, just go with it.
Yeah. So, I mean, you pretty much have to be in a flow state when you enter that Class 5. How do you get yourself into the flow state?
I do some visualization, some guided imagery. I do this if I'm heading to the green. This past winter, the green was running about twice the normal water level, which makes our Class 5 rapids more like Class 5 plus. So it's a very intense section of river at that level. And it was because there's a dam release on the river. It was very predictable. So every day, Monday through Friday, it was the same level. Very intense whitewater, super dangerous. And so I had a little process I went through, and it kind of developed through the winter, and it was working for me really well. So I just stuck with it. But I would drop the kids off at school, and I put in Metallica's album "Ride the Lightning." I just started right from song 1.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's pretty heavy. And then I'm driving down I-26 heading to the river. It's about a 30-minute drive. It takes about as long as it does to play that album. And I just visualize every single rapid. So I've done that river, thousands of times. And so I know it just like the back of my hand. And so I can just picture every single rapid, every stroke I need to take. And then there's this kind of marquee section of the river we call Gorilla Falls. And it's just a massive, incredibly difficult piece of whitewater with a big waterfall right in the middle of it. Very consequential. And so then, when we're actually paddling down the river and I'm, in that moment, I usually stop above it for 30 seconds, picture my line in my head, and peel out into the current. And from that point on, once you're into the current, there again, everything just kind of fades away, and it's just you and the water being a piece of this thing that's really much bigger than you are. Yeah. It lasts, a few seconds, and then it's over.
Yeah. And I mean, when you're in that altered state of consciousness, I mean, you're not really thinking about the experience. It's probably not really until you're through the rapid and you've finished that you're able to kind of look back and sort of remember what that feeling was like. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting this winter just because of that one particular rapid. It's really, it changed for me over the course of the winter. Like when the level first bumped up and it was apparent that was going to be what we were doing all winter, the first few days, it was, again, everything's happening at a high rate of speed. So you're kind of flying through the river, and it's just very intense, almost kind of overwhelming. You have this big emotional rush at the end. And you can kind of remember it, but it feels like a blur a little bit.
Yeah.
And then by the end of the winter, just like in the last couple of weeks, man, it happens at just a much slower rate of speed, and you can kind of remember like every little fraction of a second.
Yeah. What is that? So you talked about it being like overwhelming, like when you get through, like what is that feeling like when you've come through a really aggressive rapid?
Yeah, it's a massive adrenaline rush and a huge sense of relief. Typically for me, like I don't really feel scared when I'm in the river. Like I said, that's just not. If I'm scared in the river, I'm getting out. I'm going to get myself out of that situation as quickly as I can. So there's really, there's some apprehension above it, maybe a little tachycardia, a little increased heart rate, or some butterflies, and then below it, it's just this massive like. I don't really know how to describe it. Just it's a rush. It's an adrenaline rush, and people say a lot of kayakers claim not to be adrenaline junkies, but if you're doing that stuff, you're an adrenaline junkie. There's no question about that. I think there's like a dopamine effect too that I think you get that more from paddling something that's maybe well within your abilities. It's not pushing you to the extreme like that. But if you're really like putting yourself on the edge, then yes, it's going to be an adrenaline rush for sure.
Well, you just talked about dopamine, which, I learned over the last year is like a huge factor in flow states. Like dopamine, it's like that's the drug that basically makes us feel the reward, right? It's like
Right.
the drug that
Right.
our brain produces, and flow states are have heavy amounts of dopamine, and so that's like part of the reason why we do what we do, because it feels good to be in that flow
Exactly.
state
Yeah.
and have that dopamine. But one thing I think is interesting to kind of share with you at the beginning, like again, like academically, that I've learned that there's sort of this cycle to flow. And so we can't be in a flow state all the time, right? We just can't. And so kind of the cycle of flow begins with a struggle phase, and then there's a release, and then you drop into the flow state. And then when you come out of the flow state, there's this sort of recovery period, and then you kind of go back through that. But it was so interesting because I just heard you say above the whitewater, above the rapid, you might have an increased heart rate and you might have some butterflies. And I got to imagine that's kind of the struggle phase.
Right.
And then, I mean, something gets you from there into the flow state, and it's got to be that release.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, what is that like? What is that release like? You've got kind of got these butterflies. I guess maybe there's some fear associated with that. And
I mean, to me, it's not really fear. So maybe I think a better word would be apprehension.
okay.
But yeah, I mean, and then when you're in that flow state, there's just there's nothing in your brain at all.
Yeah.
You're just an animal.
Yeah.
Everything's stripped away, and you're just at your core. It's like kind of shows you what you're made of, I guess.
Yeah.
If you're on a perfect line and you don't sometimes you can navigate those kinds of rapids and barely get your face wet. It just feels like everything went exactly as smoothly as it could have, and that's a fantastic feeling, very rewarding. But I almost get, I don't want to say I'm always happiest with that situation, but I feel a sense of satisfaction from maybe being slightly offline or maybe flipping over in the boat in a place where I just absolutely have to roll up and I have one chance to do it. And if I am put myself in that position, and it's kind of like your back's up to the wall, you have to perform in that moment or there's going to be very real consequences, then I perform and do what I need to do. That's almost a more rewarding feeling because I knew that like I was really tested in that situation. Whereas if I was like perfect online, I wasn't really tested. I just used all the foundational skills that I had to set myself up where I wouldn't need to be tested.
So that's an interesting question. So when if you experience something that's like you get offline, like you said, do you fall out of the flow state, or are you still in flow state at that point?
I guess it changes a little bit. No, I think if I'm having to like hit a roll or move across the river in a way that I wasn't before, it's still a flow state for sure. It's more of a survival state.
Okay.
It's not maybe a meditative state. It's more of a survival state. But again, you still can't really be thinking. So I guess I'm just kind of banking on the skill set that I've developed over 30 years, that's going to be my hat of tricks that gets me out of whatever situation I've got myself into.
Yeah. And I mean, for people listening, like you're talking about this idea of getting offline, right? And, for people listening, I think that you're not somebody that's just blind to the danger of this thing. I mean, you're a trauma nurse. Like you've seen firsthand, like what can happen in these situations. Like, can you just talk just briefly about sort of the struggle?
Yeah, of course. I've experienced a lot of highs and lows in paddling since I've been into the Class V.
Yeah.
And, I've lost a fair number of friends. I've had that experience on the river several times too. And to the point where, I lost one friend in particular in a paddling accident. I was with him, good friend. And I was sort of a mentor to him. So it was just very upsetting experience. And it really took me a long time to deal with it. I still think about it all the time. And after that happened, that was back in 2012. And in 2012, I never quit kayaking, but I kind of shifted my focus and I started I dipped away from the fringe, really difficult whitewater, and started paddling more. I still wanted to challenge myself. So I was like, well, if I don't want to paddle, because what the situation you don't want to be in is where you're forcing it. So if you're not really feeling it, you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you're going to have to obtain that flow state, but you're anxious and nervous and scared and worried and you can't get there. Right. That's dangerous. That's where you don't want to be. So instead, what I did is I started doing these big endurance paddles. So I would pick like a section of river that was maybe 40, 50, 60, 80, 90 miles long, really relatively easy whitewater, and just do like a huge tour. So I got into that for a few years. And so it kind of, it's ebbed and flows over the years, but through the trauma job, I take care of acutely injured patients in the emergency room. And I've been doing that I've been a paramedic and a nurse for 20 years. So you kind of learn that like anything can happen to anyone, anytime. And yes, whitewater is, people sometimes say like, oh, it's just like, driving a car is dangerous too. No, whitewater paddling, high-end whitewater is more dangerous than driving a car. Yeah. But that being said, there's risk to everything we do in life. And so I try to do the best I can to mitigate those risks, but I still take them because I don't want to live a life without risk. To me, that's not really a life that's worth living.
I don't want to live a life without risk. I mean, and we do, whether we acknowledge it or not, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And the water calls you, and that's where you find your flow state.
Exactly.
And there's struggle that comes with it, but we got to follow our heart.
Exactly. Yeah. It's tough with kids. It definitely adds complexity to the problem. That's really, I grapple with it all the time, but I keep doing it. You
do. One thing that I find real interesting though, like again, kind of coming back to like, so I love this because I'm like looking at my own box and then I'm looking at you and I'm like, I can study this stuff, but you have the experience. And that's the cool thing. But like one of the like triggers for flow is this thing called, and Stephen Kotler talks about it and Csikszentmihalyi talks about it, but it's the challenge skills ratio. Right?
Yes, I'm familiar with that curve.
And so it's like, if we take on a challenge that's too great for our level of skill, it freaks us out and like sends us in a tailspin. But if we try to do something like that's way below our skill set, it's boring.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So it's basically trying to find that balance between our skill set and that level of challenge. Right. And so I look at you as somebody that's been paddling since age 11, had a father that really taught him the fundamentals, and you've mastered the fundamentals. Clearly, you need to be on Class 5 because that's where your challenge skills ratio is. Like somebody else that gets in the water, for the first time has no business being in Class 5 because they're not there with that challenge skills. But but that same person can find flow in Class 2.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. Because their challenge and their skills match. And so to me, like it makes complete sense that you're tackling the kind of water that you're tackling and you're doing it intentionally. And you have this risk management plan that's just intuitive. And it's really, really cool, frankly, just to be on a call with you and just kind of see somebody that's experiencing that. It's just cool.
Yeah. The other thing is, talking about like risk mitigation is I've really just started doing this in the last probably such, I'm 40, I'm about to turn 43. So probably as I was approaching 40, I started doing things I had really never done as a 25-year-old Class 5 boater, which is like paddling, doing like interval workouts on flat water, breath holding exercises, freestyle kayaking. I mean, I had always done that, but just kind of for fun, but like freestyle kayaking with the point of essentially cross training for survival. So if you can, flip your boat around in a small feature, a small safe feature, again, making the easy stuff hard and the hard stuff easy, that kind of cross trains you for being able to deal with that situation when you're offline in a bigger rapid.
Yeah.
Cardio, weightlifting, all that stuff, flexibility. So I've really, which that prevents me from getting anxious. If I know that I'm in the best shape that I can possibly be in, I feel like I'm well prepared for whatever situation I come into.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. And so you mentioned your family, you mentioned your kids. Do they paddle?
Yeah, they're getting into it. I spent the last couple of days kayaking with my older son. He's about to turn 12.
Cool.
Um, it's been interesting. I had forgotten how hard it is to learn. It's very counterintuitive. There's a lot of obstacles. You're trapped in this little boat, kind of locked into it. It's very claustrophobic. Obviously, the water's usually cold and dark and wet, and it's just uncomfortable to learn. So it's been kind of interesting watching the boys. My older son is very cautious, and my younger son is like very bold. And so I think as my younger son starts paddling, it'll be interesting to see their different styles. Because like Rylan, my older son, he'll really only, if you saw him on a mountain bike or on skis, you'd be like, wow, that kid's brave. He's a daredevil, but he never crashes. He just always was within his skill set.
Yeah.
And then, my younger son's only 7, so he's still kind of developing his personality, but it
Yeah.
seems that he's a little more, or a little less risk averse.
Yep.
But it's been fun having them out. We have a raft too, so we do a lot of family rafting, and that's just fun. There's no real risk there. It's just everybody's having a good time. So
Totally. So what's I think is interesting. So your oldest is 12, your youngest is 7. You started paddling when you were 11. Like, do you ever flash back to when you were 11, like watching your kids?
yeah, and it's been really cool because a lot of the rivers that I grew up paddling on, I didn't go to for many years, like decades, really, because they were just, I don't know, they're just kind of too easy.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to get a lot out of going there. But now it's like I've rediscovered those rivers, and I'm seeing old faces that I hadn't seen for 15, 20 years. And it's been really fun to reintroduce my family to those rivers and those experiences.
And so, like, what advice do you give to your kids kind of at that same age that you were at when you started, looking at their sort of journey through paddling and through life? Like, what advice do you give to your kids?
Well, I teach them those four questions, and how to like manage risk and assess risk. And I also it's a little complicated. Like kayaking is my thing, and so I don't want them to feel like they have to do it.
Yeah.
I really try not to put pressure on them.
Yeah.
I think there is some implicit pressure that they
Yeah.
just are going to have to deal with.
Yep.
Anytime we go to a river, I've been paddling around this area for most of my life, so I know everybody. It's a small community, and so I try to teach them that they need to develop their own life and like have their own things too. But yeah, I think you can learn a lot of lessons from paddling, and that like risk management is probably one of the big ones.
I love it. And I just have to tell you, like, in terms of flow states, right? You've sent me a bunch of videos before we talked, just so I could kind of get like a grasp of what you do, the rapids that you're, and like, I'm mesmerized. I put these videos on. I can't take my eyes off of the water. It's just, and like when you're watching anybody that's sat by a river and watched rushing water, it's just mesmerizing.
Yeah.
Just sit there. But like your videos are they're incredible. And so hopefully we'll be able to post a couple of those videos to the show notes so people can get on and see what kind of rapids that you're paddling, so that they can kind of have that feeling. But I guess I'm curious. So for folks that are listening, what we've talked about today it's about flow. It's about like the flow of a river. And for you, it's Class 5, but there were so many nuggets that you shared, like your 4 questions that you ask. These are not things that are specific to whitewater.
Yeah, absolutely.
These are life lessons. I'm curious, like, whether it's challenge skills ratio, like increasing kind of your level of skills commensurate with the challenge. Like what advice would you have for anybody listening that's, maybe feeling some of that apprehension about kind of taking whatever it is they love to the next level?
I think, developing you're not talking about whitewater, you're just talking about life in general, right?
I am. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. I think, having, I think about this a lot. Like, for example, going through nursing school and paramedic school, a lot of people have test anxiety, and I never really experienced that because I was always prepared. So I think, doing the foundational work, whether that's studying for a nursing exam or preparing for a big rapid, if you're well prepared, you shouldn't feel anxious.
Yeah.
And that should give you the confidence you need to assess the risk and pick your line and, be successful in life. That's really one thing that I've gotten out of paddling, I've been able to adapt to other facets of my life.
I love it. Be prepared. Were you a Boy Scout?
I was, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
So the Boy Scout mantra worked for you.
I mean, if you don't do the work, then you probably should feel anxious when you're being tested. But if you've done the preparation, then there's no reason to be anxious because you've done the work.
I love it. All right, Adam, like your whitewater paddling abilities are incredible. These videos that I've seen you do, it's amazing. And at some point, Hollywood's going to make a movie about you and your life. And so I want to know who the actor is going to be that's going to play in your movie.
The only one I could come up with for this was Anthony Edwards.
No, Anthony Edwards. All right. I love it.
Anthony Edwards. That's because when that show ER was really popular, I was working as a nurse and in an emergency room, and I always wore green scrubs, and people weekly would tell me I look just like that guy.
That's awesome.
I came up with.
That's awesome. So he played Goose in Top Gun, and that's top of mind for everybody right now too. So that's great. I love that. Yeah. What's your movie going to be called?
I think I'd call it Whiteout, and the reason why is because for me in whitewater, if I'm in a really big rapid with a lot of water in it, and I'm being pushed to just right to the edge of that peak performance curve that you're referring to.
Yeah.
Oftentimes there's water in your face and you can't see. And so we call that whiteout conditions. That's really what I seek out. And the cool thing about that is when you can't see, you're having to rely on just your body and the feeling and like all the input that you're getting, the sensory input that you're getting from speed, acceleration, and the flow of the water. And so that's like Jedi training, it's like you can't see and you're just flying down this thing, and you're relying on all the skills that you've developed over for me years to balance, counterbalance, and get me through that.
You just blew my mind, man. Way to take us out. That was amazing. Whiteout. And then of course you threw in the reference to the Jedi, like, my favorite, like, oh man, that was incredible. Thank you, Adam. This was such an amazing talk. For those listening, I hope you've been inspired today as much as I have. I hope Adam's story has encouraged you to listen to the voice inside that calls you to adventure, because we want to hear your story next. If you have a story to tell or you need a nudge to create one, please send me an email. We'd also appreciate it if you'd help us spread the word by leaving a review or sharing or tagging Inspire Campfire in your social media. And until next time, I want to encourage you to get outside. Thank you for listening. Adam, thank you so much for being here.
I appreciate having me. It's a lot of fun.